Alright, so today we're going to be doing a presentation on how historical trauma and cultural dissonance is affecting First Nations communities. My approach for this was to identify issues related to substance abuse and mental health issues in Canadian Aboriginal communities as it relates to previous historical trauma, specifically the effects of intergenerational trauma caused by residential schools and its effects also on their culture, as well as the effects that cultural dissonance has on First Nations people. The state of mental health across Aboriginal people, based on the 2012 Aboriginal Peoples Survey issued by Statistics Canada, it was found that between 5% and 11% of off-reserve First Nations people, specifically Inuit and Métis people, between the ages of 18 and 25 had suicidal thoughts in a 12-month period. 16 to 27% had reported having suicidal thoughts at least once over their lifetime. StatCan reports that the rates of suicidal thought are twice as high in off-reserve First Nations people aged 18 to 25 when compared to non-First Nations people in the same age group. Factors related to mental health issues in First Nations communities. Differing cultural perspectives as to what it means to be healthy are seen as being a key issue when examining the prevalence of mental health disorders in First Nations communities and people. A study by Dell in 2011 found that when examining published studies on issues of mental health and substance abuse among First Nations people between the years of 1998 and 2008, this is due to the Western cultural definition of health differing from Aboriginal cultural views of health. Dell identifies that the Western views of mental health is defined as the absence of any identifiable mental disorder, whereas the Aboriginal view of mental health is much more holistic as it integrates ideas of social health, community, family, and friends, and the health of those relationships, as well as the relationship with self, in which he describes the view that one's overall mental well-being is taken into account, which is a relationship between mind, body, and spirituality. I found from Dell's work there was three reasons primarily why this exists. So it's kind of a three-dimension model. I use this mainly just because I found it the easiest in breaking down this issue at its core. So Dell found that there was a connection to community in their view, which is traditional views of health in the Aboriginal cultures are derived from a sense of connectedness with the community and good social relationships. The Cree used the word highlighted on the screen. I don't want to pronounce it because I don't want to insult anyone. Uh, this word emphasizes community, history, identity, and resistance. It follows that to not be alive while may not mean a pathological condition of the individual, but instead something pathological in society, which I thought was a very good quote in describing this issue. This is to illustrate the emphasis in these communities on shared values, practices, to facilitate a communal bond and interconnectedness which is shared. There is a shared history of adversity, grief, due to the centuries of colonization, abuse, and attacks on their culture and practices. Dell also found connection to self. Uh, in 1997, Waldron described the Aboriginal worldview as focused more on developing an understanding of the body, the mind as a whole, and on how illness is symptomatic of an imbalance between the individual, the society, and the spiritual realm. This further development of well-being is elaborated on by the First Nations and Inuit Health Branch, who characterize it as a lifelong journey to achieve wellness and balance of body, mind, and spirit. Mental wellness includes self-esteem, personal dignity, cultural identity, and connectedness in the presence of a harmonious physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual wellness. There was also a third dynamic, which is connection to political context. This section outlines that there is a connection between an individual and their culture's history, and the weight of the adversity and struggles of the previous generation often falls on the new generation. So in 2009, McCormick, in a study, states that mental health problems are not only symptoms of individuals' distress, but also efforts to cope with untenable social situations brought on by a history of collective oppression. The issue of substance abuse isn't derived directly from mental health issues. There is a greater social and cultural context in which oppression in residential schools, for example, has led to lasting intergenerational trauma. So, on the issue of residential schools, I found a study by Bombay in 2013. Uh, Essentially, it talks about the intergenerational effects that residential schools have had on these communities. So, residential schools were government operated schools in which First Nations children as young as 3 years old were taken from their families and forced to live at and attend these schools. The schools were an attempt by the Canadian government to force First Nations people to assimilate to the overall culture. The schools were noted for their curriculum, which involved shaming the Aboriginal cultural values and traditions and instilling a sense of shame in their cultural identities. It was also notable that these schools were notorious for their extreme neglect, mental, physical, and sexual abuses. In 1930, it was estimated that 75% of children between the ages of 7 and 15 were forced to attend residential schools. There were often cases of mortalities or missing children as well at these schools. The last residential school was closed in 1969 in Saskatchewan. Uh, so some significant statistics from the 2002-2003 First Nations Regional Health Survey in relation to survivors of residential schools. 37.2% of adults who had at least one parent who attended residential schools thought about committing suicide in their lifetime, compared to 25.7% of those whose parents did not attend. 20.4% of adults who had at least one grandparent who attended residential schools have attempted to commit suicide, compared to only 13.1% who did not have one grandparent who attended. Uh, in the 2008 to 2010 survey, it was revealed that 31.4% of First Nations youth living on reserve who had a parent who attended residential schools reported symptoms of depression, compared to only 20.4% of youth with neither parent who attended. It was also found that First Nations youth who had a parent who attended residential schools were more likely to report having issues or report having learning difficulties at school. 48.7% of youth whose parents attended versus 40.4% whose parents did not attend residential schools, and having had to repeat a grade, 47.3% of youth whose parents attended versus 35.2% for kids whose parents did not have to attend. So there's the first major dynamic that kind of was found in this research is that family and culture are being hindered by these past traumas. So First Nations cultures are centered very heavily around community and family bonds and maintaining a sense of cultural identity and practice. But the First Nations community as a whole has historically faced never-ending barrage of attempts to disintegrate their culture systematically through violence, or more modernly, the use of residential schools. Uh, as shown in a study by Priest and Williams, there is evidence to support that perceived racism and discrimination also has an impact overall on someone's health. Uh, the issues we see today in Aboriginal communities can also be linked to the use of residential schools in Canada, in which children in their formative years were taken from their families and forced into an environment in which they were subjected to vehement abuse as well as shaming and attacking their culture and practices in an attempt to disintegrate them from their cultural ties. This trauma alone is easily transferred from one generation to another for many reasons. First Nations uh, First Nations cultures rely heavily on their cultural values, which, as previously outlined, was balance of self, culture, and history. But their culture has been fragmented by constant attempts to break down their practices, and this leads to a sort of cultural dissonance in which their values conflict with the values trauma that were imposed by residential schools. So, in a study by Chandler and Lalonde, It was shown that individuals whose cultures have been changed abruptly or radically are significantly more at risk of suicide, which urges the importance of cultural continuity in practice, as well as the First Nations communities who have made an effort to rehabilitate their cultures have shown dramatically to reduce the suicide rates among First Nations youth. Culture is so ingrained in individual identities across the world that there is strong evidence to support that this may be a strong contributor to the problem of suicide and substance abuse in these communities. When one experiences cultural dissonance, it can seriously impact their self perception and sense of identity, perhaps more so in First Nations communities who have a very strong and passionate set of traditions, values, and history which encompasses all facets of their lives, such as self, community, and politics. So where to go from here? Based on the information I've found and that which I couldn't find, I'd like to see more research surrounding coping mechanisms, family dynamics of residential school survivors in Canada. There's also reason to believe that due to the endless abuse that the First Nations children faced in residential schools, as well as the fact that these children often had very little time to experience a parental bond in their formative years due to being at the residential schools, I think there's reason to believe that due to a lack of coping mechanisms, fragmented family dynamics, due to a lack of experience witnessing their own parents, and use of physical abuse is prominent in households of residential school survivors due to the trauma they had to endure in their time at residential schools. The second dynamic I found was imposing conflicting health models. So, as shown by Dell, we're trying to solve the mental health problems in First Nation communities using a Western based medical approach, which prioritizes neurological disorders as root causes and remedies and tries to remedy these using drugs, whereas these cultures typically have a holistic approach where it's been shown to be more impactful due to its relevance to their cultural issues. So, because there's such a lack of harmony in these cultures between their culture and their identity due to this imposed Western view, it would make more sense to allow them to practice their own views of health. His theory is backed up by Chandler and Lalonde, who found that culture and traditions in these communities is most effective hedging against the continuity of substance abuse and mental health issues. In order to aid the First Nation communities, we must develop a system that more accurately represents their cultural practices and encompasses their defined view of health as opposed to imposing a different cultural view upon them. Uh, so here I'm just simplifying and identifying the four main sort of causes I found in this issue relating to culture and substance abuse. So obviously historical trauma, so the impact of residential schools and how it's affected family dynamics due to the trauma that these people have faced and how in their formative years they weren't really able to witness their own parents and witness what parenting styles are actually supposed to look like. Instead, they were experiencing harsh abuse and didn't really have a way of coping those familial mechanisms, if that makes sense. Which, I mean, that might transfer on to the next generation as these survivors of residential schools are trying to raise their own families now. They don't really have that concrete idea of what families are supposed to do in the event of, you know, trying to assist your children through school or trying to uh, discipline children in a reasonable way. The second issue is cultural dissonance, so conflicting views of their own culture versus imposed Western views creates internal conflicts in cultural identity. So just this this idea that their culture is being broken down and they kind of have a fragmented view because Western cultures are imposing themselves in their cultures. So allowing them to practice their own culture would significantly improve conditions because there's less of a confusion as to what is right and what is wrong. Uh, there isn't really a right or wrong, but just less conflict between ideology. Uh, Also, the Western versus traditional views of medicine argument. So, we're trying to fix an issue which is centered around cultural dissonance by adding more dissonance because we're imposing Western medical views into their culture where, you know, they just don't necessarily align perfectly. So, not allowing them to have balance in their lives the way that their culture has taught them. We're trying to add medicine and, concrete definitions of neurological disorders where, you know, to a lot of these cultures, it's more of an issue of creating that cultural bond and familial bond and spiritual bond. Uh, and this all just kind of ties back to substance abuse and mental health issues because, this past trauma and the way that it's affecting current families and this conflicting view of identity between Western views and traditional Aboriginal views kind of it creates a void in identity where people might feel like they're confused about who they are, or there's just a need for coping, and some people might find that in substance or abusing certain drugs or alcohols, things like that. And that's all.